You're listening to episode 156 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Matthew J. Hirshberg joins us to speak about how mindfulness can help pre-service teachers improve classroom skills. If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this can only be sustained with your generosity. Please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com and click on Make a Donation if you value these conversations, which can't continue without your contributions. Thank you for your help and your support. Often mindfulness is introduced as a helpful practice after you're already facing tremendous stress. But what happens when mindfulness is shared prior to joining a particularly difficult career, like education? Matthew J. Hirshberg is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's interested in the specific social, cognitive, and affective processes impacted through contemplative practice, and how cultivating these competencies supports achievement in school-based and real-world domains. Our guest today is Matthew Hirshberg. Matt, welcome to the podcast. Good to meet you.
You too. Thank you.
So it was interesting going through my regular Google alerts about new studies and seeing that, of course, Richie Davidson's organization and Madison is not sitting back, but continuing to do really good work. And that's why you're here with us today. But maybe, Matt, you could tell us just a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Healthy Minds. I did my PhD in educational psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And prior to getting my PhD, I was a classroom teacher. I taught 8th grade social studies, actually in Massachusetts, for a number of years. And during my time teaching, I had also been practicing meditation and was charged with, of course, developing academic learning in students. But the district I worked in was also very interested in what is now commonly called social emotional competencies in students. And of course, I recognize the importance of them. And the district had lots of good ideas about what was important, but when you really dug into their ideas about how to develop or cultivate those important skills, it became clear pretty quickly that we didn't know. And so, I reflected on my own experience and how I felt like I learned and about those qualities in myself, and also how to develop them. And much of that was through meditation and mindfulness practice. So I started to implement a short mindfulness practice every day and saw it made a big difference. That got me very interested in what the research might say about the impact of mindfulness and meditation training on teachers and students. And that ultimately led me back to graduate school and really to this research that we're talking about today. Big picture, my research is really interested in how we can best support teachers and students in being, happy, well, and competent as a teacher or as a student.
Great, thank you. And as we see mindfulness showing up in classrooms more and more at various levels, from the university level into elementary schools, it's important to consider, well, what are some of the benefits of having mindfulness practice for the teachers themselves? It's also, of course, very helpful for students. We see more and more studies about that. But also a few like this one that takes a close look at how does this help the teachers as well.
Yeah, and I'm often in conversation with principals, superintendents, parents about this very question. And the instinct, I think, in education generally is always to go directly to the teachers, or rather to the students, sorry, and sort of skip over teachers. And we see that in a variety of ways, that the emphasis on student level mindfulness interventions, but also in the social emotional literature more generally. Social emotional competency programs are now very common with students, but almost never are the teachers teaching those curricula required to do training before teaching them. And I think that speaks to kind of a general assumption we have that teachers and adults in general sort of already have all these competencies in place. And I think just day-to-day experience, our own experience, our experience interacting with other people, we probably come to the conclusion quite quickly that we all could develop a little bit more of these social emotional competencies and skills. So, and I think that in particular, the younger the child is, the more important it is that the adult, the teacher, the parent, whatever, possess these qualities if you want the kids to develop them, because so much of what they're learning is just observational. And we can talk all day about empathy, but if the person who's telling the kid to be empathetic is in the next moment yelling at another kid for something they didn't like, then it's unlikely that they're going to get the message and really integrate empathy into their lives. So this sample and this study was a sample of undergraduates training to be teachers to work with PK, pre-K through 8th graders. So I think at all ages, actually, all ages of K-12 or even K higher ed, it's important to work with the teachers or the professors, the instructors, but I think it's particularly important the younger the children are.
Yeah, absolutely, because there's an entirely different mindset and way of connecting with kids. Now, one's authenticity is really important, how you craft the message. And something else you said too is that there's this assumption about skills being general within the population. That's not always so. And even people who may have a long-standing formal mindfulness practice, that's a different discipline than being able to teach it, especially to a younger audience, because we're so removed from that as adults, and being a kid is different now than what it was for me being a kid. So being able to keep up with this, I think you're absolutely right. There are some competencies to develop, not just in teaching in general, but teaching specifically to the audience that you're working with.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a really good point, which is we're actually talking about several different things. So there's the ability to just teach effectively and the skills and qualities that go into that. Then there's the ability to teach mindfulness or meditation and the skills and qualities that go into that. And then there's the ability to teach mindfulness, meditation to kids in schools in an age appropriate, context appropriate way. And that may be an entirely different set of skills. So one thing about this study is that we provided no training to the participants in how to teach their future students contemplative practice. It was strictly about these individuals developing their own contemplative mindfulness practice and sort of loving kindness, compassion practices as well.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the study. One of the things that I noticed even in the title of the article, and again, for those who are listening to this episode, I'm going to have a link to the article itself, as well as a Science Direct article about it. But one of the things I noticed in there was the term pre-service teacher. And I'm wondering, Matt, if you might say just a little bit about what is meant by that. What was the cohort for this study?
Sure. So pre-service teachers are undergraduates who are majoring in education. and are in an undergraduate program that will result in state teaching licensure when they graduate. So these are undergraduates typically who, as sophomores in college, said, I know I want to be a teacher, and they've been accepted into a pre-service training program that they follow for their last couple of years of their undergraduate career. So of course, most of them will end up teaching, at least for a while, post-graduation. And excuse me, we were interested in this population for a couple of reasons. So it's a bit under debate, but the rates of attrition in teaching are quite high and probably higher than in comparable professions. So on the high end, the estimates are 10 to 12% a year, and maybe as high as 50% after 5 years. But even on the lower ends, it's somewhere around a third of teachers who will teach 5 years or more, or rather who will leave before 5 years are up. So attrition is very high, and one of the main causes of attrition in teaching is stress and stress-related burnout, and just really finding the profession so difficult and overwhelming that even though typically the motivation to go into teaching is really to support kids, even though there's sort of this pro-social motivation that's driving entry into the profession, what teachers often find when they're on the ground is more than they can manage, and then they tend to leave. So one part of the study design was really to look at undergraduates before they had been exposed to sort of the full demands of teaching, and to see whether this type of training could develop some competencies that would essentially be resilience factors, so that when they got into the field, they were better prepared. And you don't see that reflected in the paper we're talking about today, because we're still actually following this group of teachers 3 years post-graduation. So one of the bigger study questions is, does the training actually build persistence in the profession?
Yeah.
We don't know the answer to that yet. But so that was a big part of the reason why we wanted to work with pre-service teachers. We also reasoned that the mindfulness-based intervention literature with teachers has almost exclusively been with what are often called in-service or professional teachers, so teachers who are out in the field. And there hasn't been that much work, but the work is really promising, and the sort of standout effects are really reductions in anxiety, stress, and burnout. So it seems like what might be happening in the in-service teacher sample is you're seeing sort of like a remediation effect, where these teachers have developed high anxiety, high depression, burnout, stress, etc., through the challenges of the profession. And then when you bring in and implement a mindfulness-based intervention, they're learning new skills that help them reduce that stress and anxiety. So again, along the lines of sort of preventative approach, we wanted to see whether implementing it with pre-service teachers could actually prevent some of that from happening.
Yeah, what would it be like to inoculate them against getting to points of high stress, anxiety, depression, all the rest of what they're getting into in the profession that, again, is also reflected in the literature, and that high attrition rate you mentioned, because that's often not, I don't think people are really quite aware of how many teachers really don't and perhaps can't stick with a profession without these kinds of skills to meet the demands that are very high in this environment.
And we should mention as well that we're focusing on teachers and the potential benefits to teachers, but the educational context is very intertwined. So teachers that are more stressed, more burnt out, tend to have worse quality relationships with their students that then result in worse student outcomes. So I think there's a pretty strong case to be made that by intervening at the teacher level to improve teacher well-being and hopefully teacher practice, you're going to have a direct or an indirect, at least, benefit on students long-term.
Mm-hmm. So talking about the study itself, I want to ask a couple of different questions. One is, what was the intervention itself? What did that look like? And then also use the classroom assessment scoring system class, and wonder if you could say a little bit about that as well.
Sure. So one of the kind of innovative parts of the study was the intervention. So we there was a group of people who all had have experience with mindfulness-based stress reduction, the sort of paradigmatic secular mindfulness program, but also have practice experience in different contemplative traditions. And mindfulness-based stress reduction is an amazing program. It's remarkably well thought out and structured, but it's limited. It doesn't reflect the totality of contemplative practices that are out there. And in particular, it's much more focused on what you might call awareness or attention practices than on the what we call in the paper connection practices. So things like loving kindness, compassion, those sorts of practices. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but there is data to say that the majority of teachers who enter into the profession have this determination to support children's development and well-being. So there is kind of this underlying pro-social motivation. And one of the things that's been discussed in the literature is that when you enter in with a pro-social motivation and probably high levels of empathy, but it's really difficult, that can actually exacerbate the negative consequences of the difficulty. Because, I mean, one way to look at it is that you really care. And because you really care, when you can't affect change in the way you had hoped, it sort of can be devastating, right? So we sort of took a mindfulness-based stress reduction framework and then modified it in a number of ways. And one of the big ones was by including substantive training in loving kindness, compassion, and also sort of motivation practice around really directing the pre-service teachers in the sample to really get clear about what their motivation to teach is, and then working on cultivating that feeling of the desire to help kids learn and develop. So we don't have quantitative data on the extent to which they became clear about that motivation or whether that clarity affected outcomes in them. But we do have qualitative data that suggests that it made a difference. We have reports of teachers saying things like, in a moment where I was getting frustrated with the kid, I recognized that I was getting frustrated and I came back to what I'm really doing here and took a moment. So that's the type of anecdotal shift that might be in the moment really meaningful for teachers in the classroom. And then the other thing that was different about the training from the sort of standard, mindfulness-based stress reduction or the other of the most common mindfulness-based training programs for teachers is we really emphasize what we call a view component. So in some meditation traditions, it's one way of breaking down the components of the training or view, meditation, and conduct. And the view component is often described as sort of like a conceptual understanding for, we could say, how the mind works. And then the meditation is the actual doing of the techniques. And then the conduct is really like the ethical framework for how you interact with the world. And I think rightly, a lot of mindfulness-based programs have been described as experience first. So like, here's a technique, do the technique, let's explore the experience. And through that, come to an understanding kind of the view of how the mind works. And, the data is that can be very successful. But there's an argument within many meditation traditions that having a clear understanding of how the mind works is important to meditation practice because it helps contextualize what you might experience during meditation practice and therefore can really help facilitate learning. So we took that approach and we developed sort of short, pithy, simple kind of instructions about how the mind works that were inserted into each class. So these are like 5 minutes, very short, but they were reinforced through the guided instruction during the meditation practices. And again, we don't have quantitative data, to say that these components were affecting outcomes in any way, but at least the reports of the instructors who actually led the intervention, they felt like it supported. The feedback they were receiving from the participants was that they found these types of kind of, they're like framing kind of, these framing components useful.
Something you did measure though was class.
Sorry, the class.
Yeah,
Yes.
let's talk a little bit about that, because
Sure.
people who are listening understand what we've just heard from Matt about, so we don't have this kind of data. Bear in mind, that wasn't really the focus of this. That wasn't the
Yeah,
instrument
no.
you used. So let's talk about the instrument, what you did measure.
Sure. So the classroom, it's called the Classroom Assessment Scoring System, or the CLASS for short. And it's a objective third-person observational tool that was developed at the University of Virginia. And essentially what happens is someone who's trained and certified in this method goes into a classroom and observes a teacher teaching and codes in real time, in actually real 20-minute segments, what they observe. And what they're looking for is the quality of teacher-student interactions on a bunch of different dimensions. So to give you some idea of what we're talking about. So for example, they'll be looking to code teacher respect for student opinions, or the general emotional climate of the classroom, the extent to which students feel comfortable asking questions. They'll be looking at more instructionally focused parts of interaction, like to what extent are teachers asking questions that are engendering critical thinking? To what extent are teachers responding to students with sort of like declarative answers that's cut off learning versus inquiry that might instantiate a student to look deeper into their own knowledge base or explore a new facet of something they're talking about. What the coder is instructed to do is, along these three main dimensions, which are emotional supports, instructional supports, and classroom organization, code the quality of the teacher-student interactions that they see, and then this coding goes into a quantitative measurement through which we can extract a domain score in, say, emotional supports or instructional supports, and et cetera. We selected the tool because it's among, it may be the most predictive measure we have for later student achievement. So there have been several studies that have been done looking long term at like a kindergartner and the quality of the teacher-student interactions as measured by this class tool, and then predict out 5 or 6 or even longer years what outcomes that student has. So it's not a perfect measure, like, we don't have any perfect measures in psychological science, but it seems quite good, and it points to an aspect of teaching that we felt very well might be impacted by the type of training we were doing, which is how are teachers actually behaving in the classroom when they're with kids. And one of the other important things to mention about the design of this study is we measured the class at 2 points. So the first time point was when they're in what's called practicum. That means they're in a classroom with a cooperating teacher, and they may teach sometimes, but a lot of the time they're there in more of an assistant capacity. And then the second time point, the critical time point, was 6 months post the end of the intervention. And during that time, our sample were student teaching. So they had taken over all classroom duties and responsibilities. They were lesson planning, they were teaching all the lessons, they were grading, they were communicating with parents, etc. So that second time point of class measurement is a really good reflection of where this teacher sample was as they were about to graduate and enter into the field.
It's really fascinating to me because this is one of the very few times I've interviewed someone about a mindfulness intervention that didn't measure specifically mindfulness outcomes, but something about how did this impact the role the person has, which is a different set of characteristics than what we might typically have in 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire or MOS or any other mindfulness instruments.
So we did measure mindfulness. We used the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire. It wasn't our primary outcome. And it's interesting actually, because that was one of the surprising things about the study. We found at pre to post test, we found some evidence of change, intervention group change on the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire, but it wasn't super robust, and it didn't persist at follow-up test.
Mm-hmm.
So we found significant intervention group improvement on our main outcome, this objective third person coding of actual classroom behavior, but we didn't find a lot of the change on self-report that we would anticipate based on the literature. So we didn't find huge effects or persistent effects on mindfulness. We didn't find any effects. We found no stress reduction effects. We didn't find reduced anxiety, reduced depression. It turns out that in the interim, from when we designed the study and began running it to when we started analyzing the results, that a couple papers did come out with pre-service teachers and mindfulness-based interventions. And for the most part, they also didn't find effects on stress, anxiety, or depression, which is part of what led me to that opening statement that the evidence in-service teachers may not actually apply to pre-service teachers because they're in a different professional part of their experience. They haven't yet been exposed to the full challenges of teaching.
And I'd be curious if, I just, sorry to interrupt, what I'd be curious about at some point is because you did describe some of the modifications to this from an MBSR standard curriculum, and that some of the inclusions with this program specifically can target areas that class might be measuring, but also taking the place of things that might foster some of what was absent in the FFMQ results.
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible. The FFMQ one is a little hard to make sense of because the gains that the intervention group showed at post-test, that in some cases were significantly different than the control group, they didn't actually, those gains were there at follow-up, but for an unknown reason from post-test to follow-up, the control group actually sort of caught up. So this could just be measurement error, or there, that may explain it. These are imperfect measures. There's no, so this stuff tends to happen where sometimes some things just go unexplained, but
human behavior is complex.
That is right. Yeah. So to add to it, we have another paper from this study that's under review right now, where we show that the intervention group also reduced, both at post-test and persisted 6 months after post-test, significant reductions in implicit race bias directed towards children. So this is on a behavioral measure of implicit race bias called the implicit association test. And in other studies, teachers who show more bias on that test actually have students of color who perform worse academically and have higher rates of exclusionary discipline, which downstream leads to much worse student outcomes. So, as far as I know, in adults, the longest reported reduction in implicit race bias is 2 months. And in the pre-service teachers, the follow-up was 6 months. So that's all encouraging. It's a little confounding, again, that we're seeing these behavioral changes absent some of the self-reported stuff. I discuss why that might be in the paper. Sort of, it's speculation at this point, but I think it's, those are plausible reasons anyways.
So what were some of the results you saw for this core measurement of the classroom assessment scoring system?
So we found that on all 3 major domains, which are the emotional supports domain, the instructional supports domain, and the classroom organization domain, we found that pre-test to follow-up, the intervention group made significant gains. So sort of on a multidimensional, comprehensive assessment of their actual teaching behaviors that we know are related to student outcomes, the pre-service teachers that went through the intervention did show improvement. In some sense, the instructional support gains might be the most impressive. If you look at representative samples of teachers, that's the lowest in general. And there are some studies that have shown that that particular domain is related to various student outcomes. And our intervention group at follow-up test, their average instructional supports score was actually closer to like a national normative sample of in-service teachers than it was to their comparison pre-service teacher control group. So that's kind of exciting because the emotional supports domain is the one that prior research with in-service teachers has shown an effect on. And it's kind of the most intuitive that a mindfulness, loving kindness sort of connection intervention might affect. But the instructional supports one seems to drive a lot of the academic outcomes. So that was, very encouraging. And then the other thing we saw is that we saw moderate magnitude correlations between reported practice, mindfulness practice time, daily mindfulness practice time over the intervention, and these improvements in the intervention group on all of these domains. So that's further indication that there was something about this intervention and engaging more regularly in the intervention that was really predicting these improved outcomes.
So I'm curious, is there going to be planned follow-up with this same cohort over time to see how does this persist? Is there continued practice? What happens to student outcomes, sometime into their teaching career?
Yeah, so we're following this sample for 3 years post-graduation, and the last cohort, the 3-year measurement, is next fall. So we'll have all that data collected at the end of next fall. We're not doing the classroom assessment scoring system observation tool. It would be impossible. They're all over the state, and you need to send people there and et cetera. But we are looking at stress, anxiety, depression, well-being. We're looking at mindfulness. Where one of the main outcome is just persistence in teaching. Right. So at year 1, at year 2, at year 3, are these people still teaching? So those data will be exciting to see whether the changes we saw either post-intervention or at follow-up, and these, in particular, the changes in this classroom assessment scoring system measure are predicting later outcomes for these teachers.
Great. I'll be eager to hear more about those results too when you come back to talk about that.
Sure, yeah.
And I'm wondering, Matt, is there anything else you wanted to share with the listeners just about this work? Is there something in there that you found personally inspiring, or just something that you want others to know about?
Yeah, I mean, I just, this research and a lot of the other research that's been done on with teachers on mindfulness education, I find really encouraging, because I think people who haven't taught, really, it's hard to fathom just how difficult a profession it is. And we know from a lot of really good research that teachers are the most influential school-based factor in student outcomes. So supporting teachers is just hugely important. And we also know that most of the ways we try to support teachers aren't particularly effective. So there was just a meta-analysis of professional development programs, and their effect size is like very small on average. So the evidence for things like mindfulness-based interventions has really been quite encouraging, even though a lot more research needs to be done. And certainly the qualitative reports and the subjective reports of teachers about the benefits of these programs is pretty overwhelming. So I find it really encouraging that, pretty low cost, pretty easy to implement. It's quite, it's adopted well pretty much by everybody that uses these practices. And I could foresee, I hope at least, that, we could see sort of programmatic implementation of these practices into things like pre-service teacher training in the future, and that really could have a huge beneficial effect.
Great. Well, thank you for that overview, and I really did mean it. I hope you come back to talk about these future works and studies that are showing up. Our guest today, Matthew Hirshberg. If you want to find out more, listening to this conversation, I'll have some links on the episode page. Matt, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come and visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.